So I think the first thing I want to say about Matisse is that he was a northerner. He came from this town that many people call it the Manchester of France. It's up north, almost at the border of Belgium. And it's been described as a kind of a gray part of France, which it's hard to imagine France having a gray part. But his very, very bourgeois and successful father and mother ran a kind of a goods store that also had a grain business. The grain business was his father's grain business, and the building is still there in Bohemian. But Matisse probably came of age with his father really, really hoping that he would be a grain merchant and, take part in this profitable business. And here is a photo of teenage Matisse, who was dreamy and who tended to have stomach problems, maybe psychosomatic stomach problems, because he wasn't coping well with, the plans that his family made for him, or with humping the big sacks of grain across the warehouse. But his mother was very attentive to him, and when he was ill, which was often, but I think when he was ill around 17 or 18, she bought him a painting box. And the painting box opened up his imagination and gave him a door to the future. So the story goes that when he got on the train to go to Paris, where his goal was to eventually study at the École des Beaux-Arts, there's a Matisse family story that his father actually yelled from the platform, "You'll starve," which, so his father was not supportive, but his mother had argued that he could go to school. And of course, in aiming to attend for the École des Beaux-Arts, it was a two-step process. You would go to someone else's atelier first. You would have a, kind of a mentor, and you'd learn the rudiments of painting, and then you'd take an exam to hopefully be admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts. And even after his studies, Matisse failed. He did not enter the École des Beaux-Arts. But anyways, he was in Paris, and the first person he studied with was the most famous artist of the time, William Bouguereau. And that apparently was at his father's insistence, because he said, well, if you're going to study this, useless thing, you should at least have the very, very best teacher. And Bouguereau was the, classical academic artist whose paintings had this kind of perfected, very, very smooth finish. And here's an example of what one of his paintings look like. They are very, very, how do I say, they're sentimental. They are, suitable for popular taste. They are very, very refined. And Bouguereau had the wealth and arrogance to go with the kind of fame that he had achieved. But Matisse reported that one of the demonstrations he went to, that Bouguereau was he was wearing like a silk cravat standing on a platform, and he was copying one of his own paintings in front of the students. And Matisse thought that was the dullest thing he had absolutely ever seen. So he didn't last long in that atelier. He moved on to study with Gustave Moreau, and Moreau was kind of a different character. Moreau was on the edge of modernism. He was interested in mythology. He was interested in some painterly effects of surface that came from Impressionism, but mainly he was open-minded, so that when his students, who, for example, included Georges Rouault also, when they wanted to try Impressionist techniques and styles, when they wanted to differ from the academic methods, Moreau, either gently encouraged it or at least allowed it. And that's where Matisse began to make some progress towards what he wanted to do. So his first kind of showpiece, his first major painting that he made for, a show to kind of let his abilities be known, was this picture of the dinner table of 1895. It featured a woman named Camille, with whom he had fathered a daughter, Marguerite. So one of the other things that Matisse did to embarrass his family in Paris was to become, a father of an illegitimate child. But Camille posed for this painting. And the story goes that when his parents came to Paris to see it, they were hopefully going to be proud. They were looking forward to seeing this, but they gathered with a group of people that were actually ridiculing the painting. And someone was saying that they thought there were microbes in the bottom of the, wine vases, because they didn't understand the strange colors. But Matisse was picking up the Impressionist palette. He wasn't using kind of the duller academic colors. Camille left shortly after that, and Matisse soon married Amélie, a very serious-minded and practical young woman. And together, they would raise Marguerite, who you see there on the lower part of the picture, and then they had two sons together. An interesting detail about Marguerite is if you notice the black band around her neck, she almost suffocated at one point, and Matisse had to give her a tracheotomy, which that's what the black band is covering. But she turned out to be a very, very powerful and influential person in Matisse's life. A lot of people say that Matisse's family made his career, and I think there's a great deal of truth to that. So when you look at a Matisse painting at the turn of the century, you see something that seems to be in transition. It's kind of an in-between statement, because there's a rather serious, cautious young man at the easel wearing a white shirt, and yet it feels like a certain amount of color and pattern is beginning to emerge in his world. There are some rusty reds around his shoulders. There's an interest in the checkerboard floor, but he's not yet the Matisse that we know. He's maybe just on his way, tentatively feeling out the development of a new style. And in 1903, he was apparently in difficult economic circumstances. He and Amélie came back to Bohemian, and he worked in the upstairs of the grain store in this attic studio. It was kind of depressing time. Things were not going well, and he already had a daughter to support. He may have had a son to support by this time. I think the story is that Amélie ran a hat shop for income. But what you do see in this painting is you see the window, which is going to become a theme in Matisse's work. It's almost like there's a little bit of light and freedom at the end of this kind of dour tunnel of painting. And that indeed turned out to be true in rather short order. And the friendship that really opened up Matisse's life and art happened when he returned to Paris. He met these two characters, Derain and Vlaminck, and they were truly what you'd call starving artists. They were living in an abandoned restaurant on the Seine River. And the story goes, I think Derain was a boxer, and they also were burning the furniture in the restaurant to keep warm. So they were really, bohemians on the outskirts. But when you look at their art, when you look at those brilliant, off the charts, out of the tube, cadmium colors, you can see that they were rebels in color. And of course, their inspiration, not hard to miss, their inspiration was Van Gogh. And Van Gogh had been dead for a while, but the dealer Vollard, who later would be a dealer for Matisse, had Van Gogh paintings. Van Gogh paintings were beginning to be talked about by artists and beginning to be taken seriously. So he was the saint that they looked up to. And here is Matisse painted by Derain in 1905 when they were beginning to travel together to the south of France. And you can see that even if he's not quite there, his paintings or his friends were painting him as if he were the next Van Gogh. So there's a technical development. I think I mentioned this when we talked about Monet, but it's worth mentioning again, that in the 19th century, new coal tar pigments and synthetic pigments were absolutely changing the tonality of paintings. And on the left, you see kind of the earlier organic, natural ultramarine blue that was a less expensive alternative to lapis lazuli for painters. But on the right, you see synthetic ultramarine, this brilliant, bold color that we take for granted now. Those kinds of colors were becoming readily available. You could buy them at Sennelier, where a lot of people, I still buy my watercolors from them. They made colors for Picasso, the family of a chemist that set up a shop to distribute these new pigments. And they were just the right things for Matisse and for Derain and Vlaminck. And they also needed a location that would open up color. And they found it in the south of France. They found it in this little port and fishing town called Collioure, which I don't know where that town name comes from, but it delights me that it sounds a little bit like color, just the name. And they went down there and went to cheap hotel rooms, went out in the docks and painted. And the Mediterranean light and the brilliant color, all of that cut through the gray fog in Matisse's mind. And this is really where Fauvism was born. And I'll tell you in a minute where Fauvism got its name and what that represented. But you can see Matisse just absolutely transforming himself in visits to this area or with what he brought back to Paris. And I want to give you a detail as we look at this painting if we translate luxury, calm, and voluptuousness, Lux, calm et volupté from 1904 and 1905, it has this kind of cloisonné mosaic pattern, which may show the influence of pointillism, the influence of Georges Seurat, who was so interested in color theory. But there's another influence really, really coming through. This is a tiny Cézanne painting of bathers that Matisse actually owned. He owned it for about 30 years. And I think he bought it when he was making a little bit more money, maybe 10 years after this. But it was absolutely something he cherished. Matisse loved Cézanne, and you can see that the blocky brushstroke and the subject matter were something that may have, come to him through Cézanne, but the color was the revolution. The color was absolutely new. And here's a detail of that painting. And, I think a good thing to say about this painting, when you see it now and you find it bold or even shocking, imagine how it looked in 1904 and 1905. And there are a couple stories about early Matisse exhibitions, maybe in the years following this. One in particular, where when the exhibition was up, it was reported you could hear the laughter up to a block away of people just losing it over these Matisse paintings, of not understanding at all what he was doing. And when Matisse's biographer, Hilary Sperling, went back to Bohemian, 25 years ago to do research on him, there were still people alive who remembered him as a young man. And they told her that in Bohemian, his nickname had been the moron, because that's, what they concluded when they first started seeing his art. And here's a painting by Derain. So you can see that together, Derain and Vlaminck and Matisse were developing this audaciously colorful style. And by 1906, Derain was moving his own direction. And in this painting, The Road at L'Estaque, you can see this kind of great arbitrariness of color, which is something else that Matisse is going to adopt. There are possibly colors that could indicate light and shadow, or that could be reflected color. But in those bold rust and red colored treetops, you see something expressive. You see something more arbitrary, where the harmonies of the painting and the artist's interest in generating emotions from the painting take precedence over nature. And this is a good time to talk about Fauvism. When some of these paintings were shown together, the work of these three artists, there was apparently a kind of a sarcastic critic who attended one of the shows and saw a little sculpture, I think it was a Rodin sculpture, in the middle of a room that had these wildly colored paintings. And he said sarcastically, what was it? Something classical, I think he said, among the wild beasts. Fauve means wild beast. I forget what he said about the Rodin sculpture. But anyways, he found it civilized compared to what they were doing. And the name Fauvism had a little bit of a dig in it. It's an art historical name that is derogatory. And with this new opening in his world, look what happens to the theme of the window. And in fact, I'll give you a side-by-side. Look at the difference that color has made in Matisse's life, and look at now how he is literally close to the window. And the shutters, which must have in reality been white hotel shutters, are boldly colored pink and tangerine. And the water is pink and tangerine with blue striped boats. I mean, it's an utter fantasy, but it's a fantasy that is full of delight and sensuality and the joy of life. Speaking of the joy of life, this small study that he did in Collioure, in this Mediterranean town, later turned into a painting that would be purchased by the American collector Albert Barnes. So this is the study, and here's the painting of 1905 that would end up in the Barnes collection. As I've been telling people, Robert Hughes' book is called The Shock of the New. I don't think you can take in this painting without, understanding how shocking it looked in 1905. To have the figures not match in scale, to have some of the figures faceless and just outlined in red, to have the kind of, the sense of some of the figures being remote from the other figures in what they were doing, and to have it all in these cotton candy colors. It just challenged people, drove people a little bit nuts. this wasn't a French critic, but I remember somebody later, maybe somebody who saw it at the Barnes collection, called it a meltdown in a popsicle factory, which describes some of the colors. And of course, in Matisse's mind, Matisse was seeking freedom. And he also was doing something I think he did throughout his career. I think he liked to go back and take digs at Bouguereau or Gérôme or the other academic artists, because this theme of nude bathers in Arcadia or in the Glade is very, very much a theme of Bouguereau. But of course, Matisse did it on his own terms. When he painted his wife Amélie in a flowered hat, and apparently they worked together in the hat store. Matisse sometimes actually helped decorate the hats, worked with her in the business. But when he painted this painting, which is now in SF MoMA, several of her friends approached her and were kind of asked her, why would you let your husband insult you? Or, is everything okay in your marriage, or what's going on? Because this painting, taken literally, just seemed so strange, with a green stripe defining the nose. And look at the list of colors you could make in the face: blue, violet, pale green, scarlet under the neckline, and then that fantastic blue hat, which is kind of like a still life mounted on a person. Incredible. Or he also painted Madame Matisse as a Japanese woman. And like Van Gogh, he had an interest in Asian art, and getting his wife to dress up, as a Japanese woman and put on this tight wig with chopsticks through the bun allowed him to take a kind of liberty, maybe to indulge in what you and I would call orientalism, to appropriate from another culture. And here in a nude he made in 1907, I'm going to say that I think color unlocked Matisse in every way. It just didn't just unlock him chromatically. It also unlocked what he could do to the human body, what he could do to, we'll say, reconfigure the body. And this nude, at the very, very least, has broken back and broken hips. Because if you look at what's happening, where her waist should meet her hips, it's impossible, or uncomfortable, or both. And he also did something, I've got a detail here from Cézanne. You may remember this from the Cézanne lecture, that Cézanne often let you know where he had moved a limb in his paintings. He'd leave kind of a painted outline where something might have been covered up. And just like the legs of Cézanne's bather, when you look at the arm of Biskra, you can see that Matisse changed his mind and didn't mind letting that process be a part of the completed painting. So I have a story about this painting that goes back to my early days, kind of getting an art education. I worked for an art dealer in LA in the early 80s. And one day I had a job driving the sculptor Richard Serra to a party. And that was really cool, because I knew Richard Serra was quite a famous guy, and he was, friendly and talkative. And I drove him in a friend's Volkswagen, drove him to this party, and kind of interviewed him on the way, asked him a lot of questions because I was a student. And one of the things I asked him, I said, was there a work of art in your career that really, really influenced you? And by the way, if you know Richard Serra's work, you know that we now think of him working in sheet steel, huge pieces of material. But he told me that this painting by Matisse had influenced him more than any other work of art. And I said, why was that? He said, because Matisse showed the power of letting a single idea transform a painting or transform what you do. And in this case, it was the color. And I want to show you something done with Photoshop. This painting was commissioned for a Russian collector named Shukin, a tapestry merchant. And we'll talk about him in a minute. But apparently it was originally Harmony in Blue. It was what you see there over on the right. And the painting was actually considered finished, and it was getting ready to be shipped to Russia. I think the crate had been made, and Matisse just came to the studio and said, no, I don't think that's right. And he made it the Harmony in red and then sent it to Russia that way. And I think the story was that the client was very, very surprised, but then did accept the painting. But that's what Richard Serra was referring to, that ability to utterly transform something aesthetically because you have the idea or the urge to do so. Even as his career progressed, as he began to have clients, Matisse apparently had a rather tense marriage to Amélie, because she was the practical one, and not always easy to be married to an artist. And maybe you see it in this kind of morning conversation where he's still in his pajamas and she faces him like a Byzantine figure. Outside, there's patterns from a railing and tulips growing in the garden. So you at least have a window as a kind of an escape from the tension of that conversation. But if you read Matisse's biography, you find out that later in life, when he was down in the south of France during the Nazi occupation, both Amélie and Marguerite were tortured by the Nazis, and they never told him because they didn't want to disturb his art. So for the client in Russia, Sergei Sukhin, he made this first version of the dance. Actually, this was kind of the trial run. I think he made this to work up the idea and to see what he could develop. But you can see the figure has been remarkably reduced. Each figure is just really a kind of a pink form with very, very rough brushwork, charcoal on the edging. The figures have been, I'm going to say they've been modified to create a rhythm. And it's been pointed out to me that the locked arms of these figures almost look like a foreshortened heart shape. I don't know if he intended that, but he wanted to give the rhythm of the dance, something ancient, something archaic, the feeling of being in this circle and celebrating spring. I got to see this painting in New York a while back, maybe it was 25 years ago, and I was shocked how raw it looks. I mean, the charcoal on raw canvas still comes through around some of the feet and legs. I mean, talk about unrefined, it looks like just an absolute enlarged sketch. Should be pointing out again that this theme of the dance was actually something very, very French. Here's a sculpture by Carpeaux that's on the outside of the Paris Opera House, which Matisse must have walked by all the time. And you can see that, the subject matter isn't that different, but the way it's painted, absolutely is. And at the same time, Matisse was doing sculpture. And the liberties he took with painted figures, he also took maybe even more so with sculpted figures. And this figure, the Serpentine, his goal was to create a figure that really emphasized the curve of the backbone. That when you walked around it all the way, you would feel the flexibility of the figure. And of course, the result, is something that you definitely feel the rhythm of the figure, but you also feel in some way you're looking at a human pretzel, or we would say Gumby, something that's anatomically disturbing or impossible. But the rhythm, the feeling of the work of art is what he cared about, not about the resemblance. The figure was the starting point to apply ideas to. And this is the second version of the dance, which did go to Russia. It's darkened in tone a little bit, and he's modified the figures, working it out, giving them just maybe a little bit more of a sense of shading. But as an influence, I should probably point out, I'll do it with this painting, music. What I think he had in mind was Greek vase painting. He had been admiring, Greek vases in the Louvre, and he liked that terracotta color. He liked the simple outlining, and it was that kind of simplicity that he was trying to bring back into modernism. But I'll go back for a minute so you can take that in and appreciate the differences between this and the earlier version. I think he had to remove the genitals from the little boys for this to have it accepted in Russia. And speaking of some Russia, here is what these paintings looked like in Sukhin's home. And there was one room in his house, it was called the Pink Room. I have a photo of that, but not in color. But you can see how he had wall-to-wall Matisses with this big dance mural over a doorway. And I think within a short period, within a decade, these paintings were, seized after the revolution. And of course, now they are the pride and joy of the Pushkin Museum. But there was this kind of brief moment of very enlightened, very progressive collecting. This is the Pink Room of Sukhin's mansion, with this incredible display of Matisses, along with the kind of furniture you might have seen in a French palais. Working with that theme of all over color, here's an incredible painting from 1911, the Red Studio. And I understand, I think there's been a complete exhibition just about this painting going on in New York. So later you can use Google and find that exhibition, see some of the works that they surrounded it with. But look at the way that what's left of the furniture, I think, came as the last step in the painting. I think he painted the yellow first, the yellow gold, and then he painted the red later. So it's kind of the backwards of the way that you would draw something. But he wanted the red tonality to create the feeling of the entire painting and to give it this sense of pattern, this kind of great decorative feeling. But he also was giving you the feeling what he felt like to be in his own studio. One cute comment I've heard about this painting, someone once called it a womb with a view. You know, very much an indoor painting, not a painting that's political or about the cares of the world, but, you know, how an artist feels in his own studio with the crayons down there by a platter at the lower left, almost as if he's saying, go ahead and pick up the crayons or the stumps, and you can draw with me. In this image of the painter's family, you can see that with commissions coming in, with some collecting happening, they were beginning to achieve financial stability. Here are his sons playing chess with Marguerite in the background. And there's a wonderful little detail on the mantle is a bronze sculpture called The Surf, which I show you here. And many people say that The Surf is kind of a self-portrait of Matisse. So it's almost like he put himself in the picture with his family as, you know, the working man, the serf, you know, taking care of them and making all of this possible. Here's a nice piece of trivia. Matisse liked to go down to Morocco and travel down there, and he enjoyed seeing the Moroccans smoke opium and get high and stare at goldfish. Probably did that himself. And Matisse's wife, Amélie, her nickname for him began to be, she called him the goldfish, because that's how she thought of him, as this kind of exotic, brightly colored creature who lived, you know, with a view of the world, but maybe not participating in the world the way that other men did. And that's a little Matisse, not a little, it's a little image of a large Matisse painting of a Moroccan coffee house where they're staring at the goldfish with their hookah nearby. People often ask, did Matisse compete with Picasso? Did he experiment with cubism? And the answer is kind of. This painting that he worked on off and on for 8 years called Bathers by a River, it's at MoMA in New York. And it is his attempt at cubism. I don't think he ever got really comfortable with it. Maybe he learned some things from this painting about form and the way he wanted to use it or the way he wanted to reduce it. But I think he really understood that it was best to be himself, to be Matisse, and to let other things occupy him. Let Picasso be the cubist. But maybe that's his response to the Demoiselle of Avignon. He also made some paintings, and this one, of course, was made during the war. It was a tense time, but he made some paintings that were very, very reduced. And this one, The Shutters at Couillard from 1914, it's been cited as an influence for the work of Richard Diebenkorn for his Ocean Park paintings, you know, working with very, very simple planes of color and trying to suggest planes of decoration. The Music Lesson of 1917, where the theme of the window is there again, and a sculpture rests in the garden as his son takes a piano lesson. Here's another example of how Matisse's subject matter kind of overlaid or commented on the subjects of the academic painters. This is an Odalisque by the 19th century painter Gérôme, and we'd call it now an Orientalist painting, a painting that took on a kind of exotic subject matter, but perhaps in a patronizing way. So we have this woman who is, you know, a kept woman, kept by the Sultan, and probably smoking opium in the harem, but in a very luxurious, beautiful setting. And here's a Matisse painting from 1927, or it's kind of, you know, the same theme, this same kind of luxury, sensuality of the female body, use of Islamic patterns, which were a big part of his artwork. One of the criticisms that often has been made of Matisse during his life and after is people say, well, Matisse was decorative. And that's a good comment, but I think he reveled in the decorative. I think that decorative was something he saw as a strength. And whatever it was, wallpaper, carpeting, rugs, plants, anything that dazzled, created an atmosphere that he thought was complementary to his figures. So I want to talk a little bit about his another important collector. This is Albert Barnes, and he was the inventor of, I guess, what essentially was a quack medication that sold very, very well and made quite a fortune. He was one of the first collectors to go to Europe and really buy French painters in depth. He bought dozens of Cézannes, he bought Modigliani, eventually came around to buying Matisse. And by the end of his collecting career, he had bought 59 Matisse paintings. And it used to be very, very hard to see them because he had to go to the Barnes in Philadelphia, and they did not allow color photos of the collection or of the Matisses. And that was in Mr. Barnes' instructions. But when the museum moved some years ago, they lifted that restriction, and now you can see them in color. And, what would be the point of looking at a Matisse without color? Then really, taking away a lot with black and white photos. But here is a commission that he did for Barnes in the 1930s. He came to the museum and did this, set of dance images that fit into the original building. And when you see him working on that, working on the canvases, you notice he's using a long pole. And that's something he did a lot in drawing or painting. He'd do it at the end of his career because it gave him tremendous flow in what he was doing, allowed him to step back, and kept it simple. He was, I think, more popular in the United States in the 30s than he was in France. The Rockefeller family began collecting his works. And here is a mural he made for their fireplace called Le Chant. His Odalisques were commercially successful. They hit that line between being very beautiful and decorative, but also very French and desirable. But that became his kind of signature subject matter for a long time. He began to have medical trouble during and after World War II that made it harder physically for him to paint. And after he made this painting, I don't know what the year was, but he had either one or two very serious stomach surgeries. And I should know the details, but I'll just say in general, they were very, very difficult surgeries. And in one of them, he lost quite a bit of his intestine, and he also lost many of the muscles in the wall of his stomach. So it made him, made it very difficult for him to stand. He would stand only for limited periods, and he just couldn't work at the easel the way he used to. I have a couple of short clips to show you because I want to talk about Matisse's drawing. We're cramming a lot in here today, but there is just this under 1 minute clip of him drawing his nephew. And I think the thing I want you to really understand when you watch him drawing is watch how intent he is and watch how he changes his mind as he draws.
Moi, je crois que la peinture et le dessin, c'est la même chose. Le dessin est une peinture faite avec des moyens réduits. Sur une surface blanche, une feuille de papier, avec une plume et de l'encre, on peut, en créant certains contrastes par des volumes, on peut changer la qualité du papier, donner des surfaces souples, des surfaces claires, des surfaces dures, sans toutefois mettre ni ombre ni lumière. Pour moi, le dessin, c'est une peinture avec des moyens réduits.
If you took a little high school French, you probably heard him saying that he felt drawing and painting were the same thing. He saw them, unified. And I love Matisse's drawing so much. And I chose this one to show you because it shows you, it takes a little bit further what I wanted to show you with the clip, how he would let the traces of his process be part of the finished drawing. Cézanne had certainly done that. And then Matisse did it, I think, more and better. But fantastic to see the way that he used the soft eraser and let these charcoal drawings kind of pick up value and pick up form as he went, so that you never feel like Matisse was trying for what you might call perfection. Well, it wasn't perfection, but he wanted you to see as an artist, what he had gone through and what he thought was important, what he thought was refined in the end product. And speaking of refinement, his brush drawings are so perfect. And so, they show so much experience of painting and drawing brought into one image. Toward the end of his career, even though he was not religious himself, there was a nun he was friends with, and through her, he got the commission of doing this fantastic chapel in Vence. And he really designed the totality of the experience of this chapel, which is called the Rosary Chapel. He designed the stained glass windows. He designed the crucifix that goes up on the altar. He drew and designed images of the Stations of the Cross that were then glazed on a white tile, just as simple black outlines. And they also, boy, look at that. Look at the way that the color comes from the windows and lights the chapel. You'd kind of expect from Matisse that he might have made the chapel itself more colorful, but he did something else. He let the light from the windows add the touches of color. But I wanted to say he also designed the vestments, the garb and the gear that the priests use when they conduct services. And it's a working chapel, and you can visit the next time you're in the south of France. So in this, reduced situation with the problems that had been created by his surgeries, he was, full of joy more than ever before. And I want to tell you an experience I had. I saw the Matisse retrospective at MoMA, and again, it was 25 or 30 years ago. It was a long time ago. But what I remember feeling going through that show was that it's like there was a kind of a seriousness about Matisse, a kind of something about Matisse that changed when you went in the final room. The final room was the room of cutouts, and it's like there's a different mood in them. And I think in a way, even after going through something extremely difficult, he was just very glad to be alive. And here is a brief video of him working, I think with Italian tailor shears and sheets of tempera paper that his assistant had put the color onto. I remember reading somewhere that Matisse was in so much pain when he was in the last years of his life that people walking by would sometimes hear him at night. So here's a project he made inspired by these cutouts. The book is actually made of serigraphs or silk screens, but his 1947 book, Jazz, published by Teliade, is full of his own brush writing, that tells a story, and images that concentrate pure feeling from pure form, like this one of the toboggan, where someone, races by, a blue figure races by across pink snow. I mean, who else but Matisse could even try that? Or another serigraph from that period, The Sorrows of a King, a kind of a musical concert where the hands float against a blue background, and leaves and branches seem to flow by to give it the feeling of being outdoors. The swimming pool, which is at MoMA, and you can see he used kind of like a jute panel. He used a fabric panel and then just pinned the shapes up, finding where they belonged. And once he pinned it up, his assistant would paste it in place. And at the end of his career, he died in 1954, but in these very, very late works like the Blue Nude, he achieved, I don't know what I would call it except to say a kind of a Zen simplicity. He achieved a kind of perfection by using the very, very simplest means: color, rhythm, line, by just keeping it as reduced as possible, something new, some entirely new kind of power comes to the artwork from that concentration. And to hear his own words, to kind of get a perspective on what he thought about his own approach and his own career, he said that to look at something as though we had never seen it before requires great courage. I'll let that sit there for a minute. You know, just the act of looking can be courageous, and looking in a way that you see something that others wouldn't see or hadn't seen that way. And that's the essence of Matisse.